Hey everyone, this is Pete, and today I want to talk a bit about the Atari ST. I have some fairly vivid memories of playing video games while I was growing up, but I don't remember the exact years we got our various Atari home computer systems. I have a vague recollection of the older Atari 8-bits being downstairs in what was once our playroom, which subsequently became a junk-cluttered office space for my mother, but much stronger memories of both the Atari 8-bit and ST systems coexisting in an upstairs space my father converted from the house's spare bedroom into a studio of sorts. The reason for this was that even after acquiring the Atari ST, we still kept the Atari 8-bit up and running, because there were still things that we used it for. Stuff like Broderbund's print shop for banners, greetings cards and such like, and even Atari Writer for word processing. But that's probably a story for another day. A key recollection, however, is that I recognise there was a distinct difference between Atari 8-bit and Atari ST games, not just in terms of technical prowess, but also in terms of overall look and feel. Sometimes I was absolutely in the mood to play something on the Atari ST, while at others I craved the feeling of warm familiarity that the Atari 8-bit provided. The Atari ST was not the most technically proficient of the 16-bit home computers around, and I was aware of that even back in the day, particularly as I had a close friend who owned an Amiga. But for the most part I didn't find that frustrating. I recognised that the Atari ST had distinct capabilities, strengths and weaknesses, and as such I learned to accept games for how they were, rather than how I wished they would be. This is a philosophy that I continue to live by to this day. I care far more about whether or not I simply enjoy the experience of playing a game, rather than whether it's the most technically impressive out there, or if its frame rate is a consistent 60 or more. With that in mind, today I'd like to share 5 of my favourite Atari ST games. Like my previous video on 5 of the best games for Atari 8-bit, these are neither ranked in any particular order, nor am I attempting to argue that they are the 5 best Atari ST games of all time, no arguments allowed, and if you disagree you are a wanker. Rather, they are simply 5 games from the Atari ST's library that I, personally, consider to be the best, the most enjoyable, my favourite, whatever you want to call them. And as such, this is a topic that we may well return to in the near future. For now though, let's begin. And before anyone asks, no, I've never played Dungeon Master. Yet. I'm pretty sure that Time Bandit was one of the first games I ever played on the Atari ST, and it's one I immediately fell in love with, even though when I played it as a young child there were certain portions of it I found somewhat less than accessible. Time Bandit was first released for the TRS-80 in 1983, but it is most well known in its 1985 incarnation for Atari ST, making it one of the earliest games for the platform. The Atari ST version was also developed by its original creators Bill Dunleavy and Harry Lafner, who prominently credited themselves not only on the game's title screen, but also on the in-game status bar. This was fairly common practice in both 8 and 16-bit home computer games throughout the mid to late 1980s, even in the case of titles that had been ported from other platforms such as arcade machines. Time Bandit is a top-down action-adventure game that is loosely based on the format of Konami's 1982 arcade game Tutankhamun, however you pronounce it. Your goal is to explore 16 different time gates 16 times each, with the aim being to score as many points as possible, survive the enemy onslaughts, solve puzzles, and collect helpful artifacts. Time Bandit's unique selling point was that rather than each of these time gates simply leading to different levels that all unfolded in the same way, each of the game's worlds had a very distinct character, and often featured unique design elements and mechanics to contend with. For example, the Shadowland time gate leads to a maze-based collect-em-up minigame that bears more than a passing resemblance to arcade classic Pac-Man. Excalibur features a significant number of text adventure components that draw heavy inspiration from the classic Star Trek TV series. Darkside Dare challenges you to negotiate mazes with walls that are invisible until you walk into them. There are plenty more things to discover along the way too. Although often compared to Atari Games' classic arcade game Gauntlet, it's worth noting that Gauntlet released after Time Bandit was already on the market. Indeed, Time Bandit creator Harry Lafner recalls his friends first seeing Gauntlet in the arcades and calling it a Time Bandit clone. He was rather kinder, however, noting in a 2003 interview with Atari Legend that he believed the two games simply both shared elements in common with earlier maze-based shoot-em-ups. Despite being a very early release for the Atari ST, Time Bandit remains one of the very best titles to explore on the platform, and one that still holds up very well to this day. And as such, it will always rank among my very favourite Atari ST games. Interphase is a game that I never paid much attention to when it was commercially released, but when ST Format magazine published the full version on its cover-mounted disc in 1991, I decided to give it a go, and was immediately struck by what an interesting, creative and unusual game it was. Not only that, but by this point I was old enough to appreciate and understand the more unconventional aspects of the game, and have a great deal of fun figuring out its many puzzling challenges. First released in 1989 and developed by the Assembly Line, Interphase is an abstract game in which you take on the role of a computer hacker supporting your girlfriend, who is infiltrating a corporation that records and manipulates people's dreams. Rather than controlling the infiltrator directly, you can only observe her movements from afar on a blueprint of each floor of the corporation, and it's up to you to deal with the various obstacles she might encounter along the way. For example, if she encounters a locked door, it's up to you to discover an object in cyberspace that represents the door's locking mechanism and destroy it. Likewise, you can take out security cameras that trigger a response from deadly robots. But you'll need to do this strategically, in order to ensure that your brave but intensely stupid girlfriend doesn't stumble blindly into a room where the aforementioned death robots are chilling out and recharging, wander up to them, give them a big kiss, and wonder why she ends up on the receiving end of several 100,000 volts of electricity. As the game progresses, the puzzles become more complex. You'll need to send both your girlfriend and the security robots in different directions using turntables, time your triggering of various devices to ensure everything runs smoothly, and manufacture new objects to replace broken ones, all while fending off a variety of weird and wonderful security protocols in the abstract 3D polygonal world of cyberspace. Interphase will come across as an incredibly weird game when you first try it. But once you get your head around the basic mechanics and controls, it all makes perfect sense internally, and it's an incredibly compelling puzzler with a wonderful sense of atmosphere to it. And it will keep you busy for a while too. While it starts pretty simple, the later floors are absolutely fiendish in their complexity. Throughout the 16-bit home computer era, there was a certain amount of snobbishness about arcade-style games. Many people seem to believe that on the 16-bit platforms, the greater power, graphical capabilities and additional control schemes made possible by mouse control meant that games should be aiming higher and trying to provide more complex, mature experiences for people to enjoy. There was perhaps some truth to that, because the ambitious games released throughout this period really helped set a precedent for some of the more remarkable games that we enjoy today. But there was most certainly still a time and a place for arcade-style action. After all, that additional graphical oomph that the 16-bit platforms provided was ripe for the depiction of aliens exploding into bits as you obliterate them with absurdly powerful weaponry, as the continued popularity of the shoot-'em-up genre on console platforms such as the Mega Drive and PC Engine will attest. Anarchy is an interesting game for Atari ST because it's not especially original. It's pretty much a clone of the classic Williams arcade game Defender, but presented with more up-to-date visuals, parallax scrolling, and other such impressive presentational features. Supposedly, the internal working title for Anarchy was It Can't Be Done, because the aim was to create a game that featured smooth parallax scrolling and sprite movement, fast-paced arcade action, and a consistent frame rate, all presented in more than the 16 on-screen colours the Atari ST's low-resolution mode was supposed to support. Remarkably, the developer WJS design accomplished exactly what they set out to do, producing one of the most slick-looking arcade-style games for the Atari ST, and one which netted plenty of positive reviews from the press of the era as a result. Anarchy is particularly special to me for one big reason that relates to the games press. It is the first video game that I ever had a published review for. At the time of its 1992 budget re-release, I was 11 years old and for many years had been inspired by both my brother and my father's contributions to the UK Atari magazine Page 6, which subsequently rebranded as New Atari User. I had written many reviews for myself up until this point, typing them up on Atari Writer on the Atari 8-bit and printing them out to keep in a special folder. This was a big part of how I developed such formidably quick typing skills, as well as a solid command over the English language in written form. My parents figured that, as a youngster just starting out at secondary school, the time was right for me to have a go at submitting some professional written work, and agreed with Page 6's editor Les Ellingham that I might contribute a couple of reviews to the next issue. The first of these was Anarchy, and I've never looked back since. If you want to read my professional debut for yourself, check out page 65 of New Atari Users issue 58, available over on Atari Mania, and admire how far I've hopefully come.
Strike Eagle, cleared for takeoff.
My dad was always into flight simulations, particularly of the civil aviation variety, ever since he first encountered Sublogic's Flight Simulator 2 on the Atari 8-bit. This impressive piece of software would subsequently become what we know today as Microsoft Flight Simulator, so he was absolutely right to be enamoured with it. As a kid, I had an interest in Flight Simulator 2, but I also craved a little more action, which is why I was such a fan of Microprose's military flight simulators. We had a number of these, but F-15 Strike Eagle 2 was probably my favourite of the bunch, or at least the one I probably spent the most time with. Microprose flight simulators were always noteworthy for not only being impressive games with slick 3D graphics and solid gameplay, but also for having a ton of time and effort put into their packaging. Every Microprose game came in a large, well-presented box and featured a glossy manual that was as much coffee table book as it was instructions for the game itself. I learned a lot about military history, aerobatics and the basic physics of flight from reading these wonderful publications, usually on the toilet it must be said, but I was also able to put a lot of my learning into practice with the games themselves. F-15 Strike Eagle 2 probably airs a little closer to the arcadey side of the flight sim equation. Indeed, there was even an arcade machine version of it where you put in more coins to get more fuel. But its accessibility and quick-fire action made it both fun and satisfying to engage with. It's a game I really enjoyed playing and, on more than one occasion, actually dressed up to play for maximum immersion, wearing a flight helmet that was actually a balaclava, a pair of sunglasses, an oxygen mask made from a bit of paper and an old vacuum cleaner tube, and a parachute made from a school backpack. You don't need to go quite that far to appreciate F-15 Strike Eagle 2, of course. While its flat shaded polygons may of course look rather dated today, its smooth frame rate and solid, accessible yet deep action ensure that it still plays well, and it's actually still worth spending some time with even today. While it's no longer cutting edge in terms of either technical proficiency or realism, not that I'm sure it ever was in the latter regard, it's an Atari ST game I will always have a lot of time for. Probably the least well-known game on this list, Soldier 2000 is a game I found striking for a number of reasons back in the day, and having returned to it more recently, I found that I still enjoy it a great deal. While I never would have admitted it back in the day, the thing that drew me to Soldier 2000 more than anything when I was a youngster was the attractive female main character on the cover art, who appeared in a rather sexy form-fitting leotard on the game's armory screen before you equipped her with various items of death and destruction, plus some protection obviously. I wouldn't have kept coming back just for her, however. I found the actual game experience of Soldier 2000 rather enjoyable too, particularly once I got my head around what was going on and understood that it was more than simply blasting everything mindlessly. First released in 1989 by Artronic, Soldier 2000 places you in the role of a futuristic infantry officer who has been sent, alone of course, to infiltrate a number of locations where hostages have been taken. Your job is to obliterate the terrorists infesting each location, rescue the hostages, ideally without accidentally shooting them or blowing them up, and keep yourself from getting brutally murdered. Unfolding from a combination of side-scrolling and first-person perspectives, Soldier 2000 is primarily a mouse-driven action game that in many respects is comparable to ports of light gun arcade games to the Atari ST. Where Soldier 2000 distinguished itself somewhat, however, was in the additional depth it added atop the basic shooting formula. Not only did you have to blast enemies, but you also had to move, explore, pick up items, and sometimes even make use of night vision to pick out enemies in the darkness. While relatively simple in execution, it's a solid game that I still enjoy returning to today. Couple that with a hot redhead, and it most certainly has a place among my 5 favourite Atari ST games. So those are my picks for now. I'll reiterate that these of course are not the only games I think are any good on the Atari ST, they're just some of my favourites that immediately came to mind while putting this video together. I'm pretty sure we'll return to this topic at some time in the near future, but for now I'll just say, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.